Matilda of Flanders, who could also have been known as Mathilde or Maud, is an often brushed over figure, famous only for being the wife of William the Conqueror, of supposedly agreeing to his hand after he beat her up, and for being very short. As this video, and part 2 in our next video, will show, only some of these facts are true, others are definitely false. And much more evidence shows her as a powerhouse of a woman with influence over her husband, their children, and his lands. Much of Matilda's early life is shrouded in mystery. A tentative date for her birth year exists of 1031. Her parents, however, we do know, the future Count Baldwin V of Flanders and Adela of France, daughter of Robert II, King of the Franks. The reason for Matilda's birth year of 1031 is attributed to a contemporary chronicler, William of Jumieres, who stated that Baldwin apparently rebelled against his father in that year, partially because his marriage to Adela was unconsummated. This is not likely, however, as in fact Baldwin had rebelled much earlier than this and he and his father agreed to co-rule in 1030. Further to this is the fact Matilda had 2 brothers, Robert and Baldwin, and it's not sure what order they were born in. There were apparently other brothers and sisters, but no details remain for them, so we cannot even be sure if they existed or not. Flanders itself was a hugely important principality, a stepping stone between England and France, important for trade as well as for holding back invasions from Scandinavia. Prior to Baldwin V, Flanders had struggled with both Germanic and French languages being spoken, large areas were uninhabitable as swampland, and towns were small compared to their neighbour of Normandy. But Matilda's father improved his lands by creating new roads and canals to stimulate trade, especially in wool, and this in turn modernised Flanders' growing urban centres. But this wasn't the only reason Matilda was described in her lifetime as high-born. She could also claim lineage to Alfred the Great of England, the Holy Roman Emperor Charlemagne, and was related to most of the French nobility. From the day of her birth, Matilda was a glittering prize for those who wanted to marry into this wealth, power, and ancestry. The 12th century chronicler Lambert of Ardres gives a detailed description of the castle where Matilda grew up in Bruges. It was made of wood, was large and grand, and stood on a hill overlooking the town below. It was made up of cellars and granaries on the lowest floor, with the dwelling areas on the next story up, including the grand chamber for Baldwin and Adela to sleep. Matilda would have spent time in a large private room just off this with the maids who watched the children, and would have slept on the uppermost story of the property with her sisters, if they indeed existed, her brothers on the other side of the palace. Matilda's main female role model was her mother Adela, who interestingly had something of a marriage of equals with her husband. She played an active role in the politics of her husband's lands, and her signature appears on more than half the charters issued during Baldwin's reign. From the start, Matilda had a strong influence of a noblewoman participating in running a kingdom. Not only this, but Adela oversaw the education of all her children, something expected of noble and royal women at this time. Unlike later centuries, higher-born women in the 11th century were almost expected to be intellectually more educated than their husbands, encouraged as daughters to read while sons practiced hunting and training for war. Matilda almost certainly knew Latin, which was spoken at court, as well as Flemish, although less likely that she knew how to write. Noble women had clerks to write for them as they dictated, but she was still literate in the sense of being able to read. She would also have learned embroidery and possibly the harp and viol, 2 instruments that were extremely popular at the time, and of course, she would have learned how to manage an estate. And most importantly for the time in which she lived, Matilda would also have received a strong education in religion. Adela was responsible for encouraging Baldwin to reform the church in Flanders, as well as founding several abbeys and collegiate colleges. Little surprise, she later became a nun. Matilda would also have been influenced by her devout aunt Judith of Flanders and her grandfather King Robert, also known as the Pious. Matilda was alive at a time when the monastic movement was sweeping across all of Europe, and she would later become one of the biggest patrons of it in both England and Normandy. Matilda may also have become influenced by another powerful woman, Emma of Normandy. Emma had married Ethelred of England in 1002, and when he was defeated by his rival Canute of Denmark, she had in turn married him as well, becoming Queen of England twice, the first woman to do so. Emma had grown a great fortune of her own and had great influence over both husbands, although her second marriage appeared to be more between equals. She was exiled by Harold Harefoot in 1037, and Baldwin generously offered her sanctuary in his lands. Although, in reality, this was likely to make what might prove to be a great ally. While Matilda was likely very young when Emma arrived, perhaps younger than 6 years old, the exiled queen stayed for a few years, and it's likely Matilda gained the benefit of her experience at the English court. During her stay in Bruges, Emma paid her own way and used her extensive network throughout Europe to promote her son Harthacnut as the rightful king of England. In 1039, Harold Harefoot was dead, and Emma and her sons were triumphant as they returned home to England. It was a masterclass in politics, allies, and how a woman could influence matters seemingly run by men. There was no set age for when girls were married off, but as would become common in later centuries, marriages could happen as young as 12 for daughters. In her late teens, sometime around the late 1040s, Matilda's father received an ambassador from the English king, Edward the Confessor, an English thane known as Breitrek. He was apparently conventionally handsome and masculine, with blonde hair and an enormous wealth under his control back in England. The Chronicle of Tewkesbury claims Matilda fell instantly in love with this man, who was probably 10 to 20 years older than her. When he returned to England, without her parents knowing, she sent an offer of marriage. This was the ultimate in 11th century teenage rebellion in an era when daughters were expected to acquiesce to their parents' knowledge and choice of a future husband for them. As it turned out, Breitrek wasn't interested and he rejected her offer. Matilda was furious. She had risked her reputation and the anger of her parents to someone who was, despite wealth and good looks, her social inferior, and had been rewarded with the embarrassment of a public rejection. It was something she would never forget, and in later years it was Breitrek who would regret how he had handled the event. But by 1049, when Matilda was about 18, her father was eager to put the whole rejection behind them. He began to look across the border to his powerful neighbour, Normandy. They were increasingly Frankish in their ways and language, but Normans were also proud of their Scandinavian roots, having been founded as a Viking settlement just the century before, and leaned into the idea of being powerful Nordic warriors. At that time, the duchy, for its current leader had named himself as the first Duke of it, was Duke Robert I of Normandy. He had only 2 surviving children, a daughter named Adelaide and a son, William. Both were illegitimate, although whether they shared a mother is unknown. William's mother was a local girl named Herleva, whose father was either a tanner, undertaker, or apothecary, and she and Robert probably met when he was in his mid-20s. In short, she wasn't noble. Robert seems to have genuinely fallen in love with Herleva, however, as when she became pregnant, he ensured her comfort and gave her relatives prestigious positions at his court. Many years later, after William took control of both England and Normandy, stories were created around his birth to show he had always been destined for greatness. Of his mother dreaming of her insides stretching out and covering both England and Normandy, or the tiny newborn William grabbing the rushes from the floor with unequaled strength for a baby. At the time, in reality, no one even gave thought to record his birth anywhere, just the baby of a liaison between the Duke and a local woman. However, William's father was proud of his only son and brought him up by his side at court. He would, as it turned out, be his only son. In January 1035, he named the boy as his heir. While later chroniclers were sensitive to his nickname of the Bastard, writing from eras when this word carried great shame, there was no such stigma at the time of William's birth. Marriage still did not always occur in favour of instead keeping concubines, and illegitimacy was not considered a barrier to inheritance. By 1049, William had, after a struggle for his rightful place and lands from his uncles, become a respected and feared leader across Europe. He had proven more than once that he was forceful in his military might, and for the 11th century world, brutal savagery was the yardstick of a good ruler. William had grown into a dominating and inflexible man, and was known for his brutal punishments to those who were on the losing side. However, none of this would have mattered had William not also been astute in political matters and recognised that brute force alone would not be enough. He was also, oddly enough, extremely pious and devoted much of his life to religious pursuits, including reforming the church and building several flourishing churches across his domains. Matilda and William could not have been more different physically. Excavations of the little remains we have of their possible bodies, their remains having been shuffled about and damaged during religious riots, show William was probably about 5'10", an enormous height at the time, and spoke with a harsh, raspy voice. Matilda was around 5 foot tall, a normal height for women in those days, despite misreports of her remains once suggesting she was only about 4 foot. She was slender and apparently very beautiful. But looks were not important, politics were, and William could immediately see the attraction of Matilda as his wife. There were many other accomplished and attractive noblewomen who were eligible, but Matilda had been brought up to understand politics and, importantly, knew something of international affairs. Her lineage was also flawless, and while his own illegitimacy wasn't a barrier to take the dukedom, Matilda's heritage would make life a lot easier for both William and their potential children. When Baldwin received messengers bearing William's offer of marriage, he was glad to listen to them. His lands were being threatened by the Holy Roman Emperor, and the English King Edward had agreed to send men to Flanders coast to aid the Emperor. Both William and Baldwin could do well out of being friendly allies, and for Flanders, an alliance with the powerful Normandy dukedom would increase trade for them across Europe. However, Matilda herself apparently refused to marry William on the grounds of his illegitimacy. The story goes that he was so infuriated by the snub that William rode with all haste to Bruges, accosted Matilda as she came out of church, and dragged her into the mud by her hair. He then proceeded to beat her within an inch of her life before riding off and leaving her to be tended by her bewildered female attendants. Her father immediately declared war on Normandy for such behaviour, but then he was shocked by Matilda apparently claiming she would marry none but William, who, she claimed, must be a man of great courage and high daring to have beaten her up in her own father's lands. A great deal of this story is likely very, very false, with a tiny grain of truth. It is possible that Matilda initially refused the match, although quite how much say she would be allowed, especially after the debacle with Breitrich, is very debatable. The story described above never appeared in any contemporary source, but rather in two dubious sources about 200 years after William and Matilda lived. The idea that a noble or royal marriage would start off this way is unthinkable, especially given how much Adela had impressed into her daughter her ancestry and position. And while it's not impossible William, a man with a renowned violent temper, might have thought about taking his rage out on Matilda, it's hugely unlikely that Matilda would somehow wish to marry him after this. It is possible Matilda may have felt less than thrilled about the match. It's even possible gossip reached the Norman court. But nothing is certain about the story, only that the sources for it are not contemporary and are unreliable for their bias. With the betrothal confirmed, William then turned his attention to gaining permission for the marriage from the Pope, but initially the marriage was condemned. Although marriage wasn't formally part of society yet, and the church itself was not the powerhouse it would become a few centuries later, it was still prudent to have its blessing on the matter. One of the new laws created by the Church to maintain control over ecclesiastical matters in Europe, and so by default the grasp of power in Europe, was that of only allowing marriage outside of 7 degrees of kinship. It's thought this could have been a possible reason for the Church rejecting the marriage, as Matilda and William were at least related in both the 5th and 7th degree. However, it's important to note at this point that the church's rules probably did not stem from any real concern over the possible incest of two people related only by an ancestor 7 generations before, but in the control this gave the church. If you were on friendly terms with the church, you could reject your wife if she didn't give you an heir if you were too closely related, or escape an abusive husband for the same. If you were on bad terms with the church, they could reject your marriage to make things difficult for you, gleefully knowing you and your potential spouse merely shared a great-great-great-great-grandpa. For William, the Pope was nervous, as was most of Europe, at the idea of this young duke gaining even more power and wealth than he already had, by aligning Normandy with a niece of the King of France. And while William could simply have gone ahead with the marriage anyway immediately, as some rulers did, his religious devotion wouldn't allow it. The Duke had a contingent of bishops and ecclesiastical advisors around him at all times to allow him to do penance for his savagery on the battlefield. So at first, he sent the most pious of his bishops to reason with Pope Leo. 2 years of fruitless negotiations went on until at last William's piety was worn down. Baldwin was equally as determined the match should go ahead to give him a powerful ally for Flanders, and William wanted Matilda. The marriage went ahead anyway, without the blessing of the church, and while the date is uncertain, Matilda and William were certainly married before the end of 1053 when she was described as his consort. Even the place is uncertain, as some sources say the wedding took place in the cathedral at Eu, or in the chapel of the castle there, and other sources still place it in Rouen. Some historians suggest this might mean the wedding took place secretly or with little celebration, not unexpected if they didn't want the church to immediately catch wind of it. In 1476, an inventory was taken of treasures held at Bayeux Cathedral, amongst them 2 matching cloaks believed to be the wedding garments of Matilda and William. They were covered in small golden crosses, precious jewels and embroidered flowers, along with a wide strip of cloth of gold across the back. This was not necessarily meant to be stylish, but more an advertisement of how wealthy they were. William even possibly wore a helmet at the ceremony to emphasize his warrior nature. Early on, Matilda made it clear she was not going to sit back and be a demure wife popping out heirs. William took the opportunity to remove his uncle, the Archbishop of Rouen, who apparently objected to his nephew's marriage on the grounds of consanguinity. However, the official reason was that the Archbishop spent more time on hunting and spending money on luxuries than he did spending time in religious duties, and his removal was approved by a papal legate. The real reason is probably also that William saw a possibility to remove a relative who was something of a rival who wanted his duchy, but the interesting part is that sources for this event state it was both William and Matilda who decided to remove his uncle. William and Matilda then travelled to his palace at Rouen, the gleaming capital of Normandy, along with her parents who stayed on for a few days until the wedding festivities were finished. Not only was it likely the Duke wished to impress his pretty new bride, but equally to show her off to his subjects, allowing her impressive ancestry to outshine any doubt over his own. And more than this, their marriage brought attention from other lands outside France, as Edward the Confessor sent a message that he wanted to name William as heir to the crown of England. To prove the validity of his offer, he sent 2 hostages with his Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert of Jumieges. Thing is, they were Wulfnoth and Harkon, the son and grandson respectively of Earl Godwin of Essex, someone Edward wanted to keep in check. While it may seem strange that Edward wanted to pass his throne to a duke from Normandy, there had actually been a lot of ties between the 2 places. Both countries had a shared Viking heritage, and many spouses had gone between Normandy and England to marry into the other's royal family for at least over a century. King Edward himself had spent a good chunk of his childhood with his siblings in Normandy, so he knew it pretty well, and probably had fond memories of living there. Added to this was the fact Edward had no children with his wife Edith, who happened to be the daughter of Earl Godwin. There's a theory that far from not consummating his marriage with Edith because of his piety, Edward actually refused to sleep with Edith because of his growing dislike towards the ambitious Godwin family. Eventually sending Edith off to a nunnery and outlawing her family was what triggered the need for him to name another successor. Considering his ties to Normandy, it's not surprising he looked across the channel to William. William even had some hereditary connections through his great-aunt Emma of Normandy, and Matilda had even closer connections, and importantly could trace her ancestry to Alfred the Great. But having said all this, despite the connections made, we can't even be certain that this offer was ever really made. Most evidence comes from Norman writers chronicling events after they happened, so it could be true, or it could be made up in order to justify what William did. It's not as though Edward was still around to ask by that point. But on the flip side, the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle also confirms that William travelled to England in 1051 to make certain this was a real offer of the throne, and the English king gave the Duke a ring and sword as proof of his promise. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle was pro-English before anything else and wasn't likely to bother puffing up a Norman duke who invaded, so we can perhaps give this source a little more consideration. And even if William took it seriously, he must have known he was unlikely to receive much support for his claim in England. And obviously the powerful Godwin family, who controlled most of southern England, would oppose him. But however enticing the prospect of one day becoming England's king must have been, he had more pressing concerns closer to home, and Matilda would take an active part in them. Henry I, King of France, had made an ally of William's enemy Geoffrey, Count of Anjou, as well as supporting a rebellion led by William's two uncles, Archbishop Mougere and William of Arques. This left Normandy in a dangerous position, surrounded on all sides by enemies. The Duke's usual tactic of stab first, ask questions later worked well in seeing off Mougere and Arques, even when they were bolstered by forces from the French king. They would later flee Normandy forever. However, Henry and Geoffrey worked together to continue leading campaigns into Norman territory in 1054 and 1057, and this was harder to shake off. Matilda must have been somewhat dismayed by events, not least because no one likes fighting over an easy life, but because her marriage had been intended to create closer links between France and Normandy. The ongoing conflict proved that this simply wasn't happening. However, Matilda remained the steadfast, loyal wife by William's side, and it wouldn't be long before she probably took on her role as peacemaker. This was considered a position unique to royal and noble wives during the 11th centuries, as well as centuries before and after, of a wife being able to use the fact she was female to peacefully mediate a resolution between warring parties. It's highly likely that although it isn't recorded, Matilda used her position to try to calm the waters when necessary. On top of this, she had also fulfilled one of the main duties necessary for a duchess, creating heirs. Not long after their marriage, Matilda gave birth to a boy named Robert after both William's father and her grandfather, the King of France. Like a lot of their children, the exact date of little Robert's birth isn't certain, but it was possibly around 1053. Matilda was immediately in love with her firstborn child, but William was less impressed, nicknaming him Curthose, or Short Boot, due to his short height. It was the first time there would be conflict between Matilda and William, with one parent doting on the child and another being unnecessarily cruel. She would go on to give birth to 3 more sons, Richard, who was born around 1055, and little William in 1060. Her last son would be Henry, born around 1068 after his father became King of England. Matilda and the Duke also had daughters, but the chroniclers gave them far less notice, and as a result, it is difficult to know their names and dates for certain. The eldest daughter may have been Adeliza, born around 1057, and then Cecilia in 1058. There was also Constance, born sometime before 1061, and Adela, who would have been born just after the events of 1066. There may have been 2 other daughters, respectively named Agatha and Matilda, but the evidence for them is very scanty, and Agatha may in fact be Adeliza. What is certain is that Matilda was pregnant several times, and at a time when midwifery was simple and difficult, even noble and royal women could, and often did, fall prey to being ill after childbirth, dying from fever or blood loss, or simply from being too weak during pregnancy due to a diet low in protein and iron. On top of this, the life expectancy of infants was extremely low, and if someone managed to survive beyond the age of 5, they had a good chance of making it to adulthood. Amazingly, not only does Matilda appear to have remained healthy and strong throughout her many pregnancies, at least 8 of her children survived beyond infancy. It's possible there were some miscarriages that were not noted down, but it was still an amazing feat to pull off in the 11th century. This ability to give birth to so many heirs protected Matilda's position immensely. Matilda's role as a mother was especially important in the formative years of her children, especially as children up until the age of 7 were considered to have no moral reasoning. Therefore, their mother acted as a sort of moral compass who watched them closely, as well as providing the beginning of their education. While the children would not have been breastfed by their mother in order to allow her to become pregnant again quickly, instead having a wet nurse for that, the evidence shows that the children were all brought up alongside Matilda at her husband's court. She even had some help from the children's grandmothers, as Herleva and Adela both came to visit for extended periods of time and knew their eldest grandson Robert as a result pretty well. William of Malmesbury also states that despite the fact boys would have mostly been focused on by their fathers, both Matilda and William looked after the education of their children. As boys were expected to start learning how to ride and swing a sword from a young age, William likely took great pride in teaching his sons this. But Matilda would have focused on the other important aspect for them, that of reading, writing, and Latin. Sons were also expected to take part from an early age in politics and to have a good grounding in it. Sources show all 4 of their sons were witnesses to several charters while still children, and with her understanding of international politics, it's likely Matilda took on another role expected of upper-class women to advise them politically and on matters of policy. Added to this was the role of teaching them about religious matters, something William was also keen to impart on his sons. However, despite the Duke's focus on his male heirs, Matilda did not neglect her daughters. At that time, there were only 2 avenues open to daughters of the nobility: marriage or the church. Marriage wasn't guaranteed, as young men often went off to battlefields and died, leaving a population made up of more women than men. But the Duchess was determined her girls should have at least as good an education as she herself received, and she employed tutors to ensure it, such as Arnulf of Chalk, who was hired to teach the arts, Latin, rhetoric, and logic. Sources appear to show the girls were all close to Matilda and remained by her side until they had to leave either for a nunnery or marriage. The Duchess also made sure to carefully choose the tutors for her sons as well, and her eldest son, Robert, had at least 3 to prepare him for one day ruling Normandy after his father. Everything seemed to be going well for Matilda and William and their growing family. Their marriage was successful both in terms of expanding their brood and in a partnership between them both. The economy of Normandy had a boost throughout the 1050s through art, culture and wine, and the Duke and Duchess built many luxurious palaces to fit their lifestyle, some of which can be glimpsed through their remains today, at places like Cannes, Bayeux and Bonneville-sur-Touques, which was apparently their favourite. Many powerful noblemen and ecclesiastical advisors flocked to Normandy's flourishing court, either to seek a powerful position or generous patronage. Matilda was the centre for the poetry and culture that grew at court, however, commissioning histories of her and William's families, as well as patronising Latin poets and other literature. She would also raise the standard and etiquette of the Norman dynasty by overseeing grand banquets filled with pork, venison, beef, swan, heron and duck, all prepared with spices and herbs that would have been out of reach for the lower classes, as well as ensuring there were entertainments in the forms of musicians, jesters and poets. And further triumph came in 1059 when a new pope was elected, Nicholas II. However, the previous pope, Benedict X, had been deposed, and William quickly offered military assistance to the new pope against Benedict, in exchange for the tiny matter of seeing his marriage and children as valid. The approach worked, and Nicholas retroactively sanctioned their marriage, asking only that they make penance by building 2 new abbeys. This they would do, creating the Abbey of Sainte-Trinité and the Abbey of Saint-Étienne at Caen, as well as founding several hospitals throughout Normandy. Life was going well, and yet Matilda would face her greatest challenge yet, as William would change the course of European history forever by invading England. Throughout it all, Matilda would remain his loyal wife. But she would also rule Normandy alone as regent, become England's first Norman Queen of England, and influence the lives of not just her husband, but also of her children long after her death. Come back next week to see part 2 of Matilda's story. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss any new documentaries.